This is the chilling true story of 10 courtroom dramas that didn't just define a century, they redefined what it meant to be an American. Number 1. Sam Sheppard, the Media and the Murder of Marilyn. The quiet, seemingly perfect life of a suburban doctor, the brutal, unsolved murder of his pregnant wife, and a media frenzy that didn't just report on the crime, but actively participated in the hunt for a killer. This is the story of Sam Sheppard and the trial that became a national referendum on the presumption of innocence. The date was July 4th, 1954, in Bay Village, Ohio. Dr. Sam Sheppard was a prominent osteopathic surgeon, handsome, respected, and part of the local elite. His wife, Marilyn, was pregnant with their second child, a picture of 1950s domestic bliss. At 5:40 a.m. that morning, Sheppard called his neighbor, Mayor J. Spencer Hawk, in hysterics. He claimed he had woken to Marilyn's screams, confronted an intruder, a bushy-haired man, who knocked him unconscious, and that his wife was dead. When police arrived, the scene was one of horrific violence. Marilyn was dead in her bed, having suffered 35 blows to the face and head. But the physical evidence was confusing. The house was in disarray, seemingly suggesting a struggle, but several items, including Sheppard's watch, were missing. The police investigation was sloppy, but the media coverage was anything but. From the moment the murder was reported, the Cleveland newspapers decided Sam Sheppard was guilty. Led by the Cleveland press, the media campaign was unrelenting, creating a pressure cooker environment unlike anything seen before. Headlines screamed, "Quit stalling, bring him in," and "Why no inquest?" Journalists demanded the arrest of Sheppard, suggesting police incompetence or a cover-up if he wasn't charged. The public, fueled by daily sensationalized reporting, turned on the handsome doctor. This aggressive, pervasive media narrative essentially poisoned the jury pool and, arguably, the entire justice process before the trial even began. It was a terrifying demonstration of the power of the press to shape perception into fact. The trial began on October 18, 1954. The proceedings took place in a circus-like atmosphere. The small courtroom was so overcrowded that a special table was set up inside the bar enclosure for the dozens of reporters covering the case. Microphones and cameras were everywhere. The jury was not sequestered, meaning they were exposed daily to the exact same damning newspaper headlines the public was reading. The prosecution's case was largely circumstantial, relying heavily on the narrative of the unhappy marriage and presenting Sheppard as a liar whose story of the bushy-haired man was fabricated. The defense argued the intruder theory, but they were fighting a losing battle against the powerful tide of public and media opinion. The jury deliberated for 5 days. On December 21, 1954, Sam Sheppard was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Sam Sheppard spent nearly 10 years in prison before his case reached the Supreme Court of the United States. In the landmark 1966 decision, Sheppard v. Maxwell, the Supreme Court overturned his conviction, ruling that the pervasive, prejudicial publicity had created a fundamentally unfair trial. Justice Tom C. Clark wrote that the trial proceedings resembled a Roman holiday and that the trial judge failed to protect Sheppard's Sixth Amendment right to a fair trial. Sheppard was retried in 1966, this time defended by the legendary F. Lee Bailey. He was ultimately acquitted. The Sam Sheppard case remains the defining cautionary tale about the dangerous intersection of media sensationalism and criminal justice. It established the responsibility of trial judges to actively protect the integrity of the courtroom from the blinding glare of the press, leading directly to the implementation of gag orders and sequestered juries in high-profile cases. Number 2. O.J. Simpson, the trial of the century. A white Bronco chase on live television, a bloody glove, and a verdict that ripped America in two along racial lines. No single courtroom event of the late 19th century captured the nation's attention or exposed its deep divisions like the O.J. Simpson murder trial. On the night of June 12, 1994, Nicole Brown Simpson, the ex-wife of football legend O.J. Simpson, and her friend Ronald Goldman were brutally murdered outside her Brentwood condominium. The violence was extreme, characterized by multiple stab wounds. O.J. Simpson was at the time one of the most beloved figures in America, a Heisman Trophy winner, an NFL Hall of Famer, and a successful actor and sports commentator. He was famous, wealthy, and universally recognized. The evidence quickly pointed toward him, and the ensuing slow-speed police chase on June 17, 1994, which preempted the NBA Finals and was watched by an estimated 95 million viewers, solidified the case as a national obsession. The trial, which began on January 24, 1995, was a television event, broadcast live gavel to gavel. It lasted 252 days and transformed the lives of everyone involved, from the charismatic defense attorneys, the so-called Dream Team, including Johnny Cochran and Robert Shapiro, to the meticulous, stoic prosecutors, Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden. This wasn't just a murder case, it was a societal argument. The prosecution focused on O.J.'s history of domestic abuse and the overwhelming physical evidence, blood samples, footprints, and the infamous leather glove found at O.J.'s home. The defense, led by the incomparable showmanship of Johnny Cochran, skillfully reframed the narrative. They argued the evidence was unreliable, poorly handled, and, most powerfully, planted by a racially biased police department. The introduction of LAPD Detective Mark Furman, who was exposed as a perjurer who had used racist language, was the fatal blow to the prosecution's case. Cochran's closing argument included the line that became an instant cultural flashpoint, capitalizing on O.J.'s inability to fit the key evidence. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. On October 3, 1995, the verdict was read. America held its breath. Stock trading dropped, phone calls plummeted, and an estimated 150 million people watched the live broadcast. Not guilty. The reaction was immediate and polarized. In the largely black community, there were cheers of vindication and relief, a sense that a black man, for once, had escaped the perceived injustice of the LA legal system. In the largely white community, there was shock, outrage, and a sense that justice had been entirely subverted by celebrity and race. The O.J. Simpson trial forever changed American culture. It pioneered reality courtroom coverage, established the phenomenon of the celebrity defense team, and, most critically, exposed the profound, unresolved chasm in how black and white Americans viewed the police, the justice system, and the very concept of fairness.
Number 3. Rodney King versus LAPD officers. When the video lies. An image. A terrifying, shaky video clip. A man on the ground being beaten mercilessly by uniformed officers. The whole world saw it. But when the verdict was read, the world discovered that seeing wasn't necessarily believing. This is the story of Rodney King, the LAPD officers who beat him, and the verdict that ignited a city. On the night of March 3, 1991, Rodney King, a black motorist, was stopped by California Highway Patrol officers after a high-speed chase in Los Angeles. When LAPD officers arrived, a brutal assault occurred. Unbeknownst to the officers, a plumber named George Holliday was watching from his balcony and videotaped the entire incident. The 81-second footage showed 4 white officers, Stacy Kuhn, Lawrence Powell, Timothy Wind, and Theodore Brazino, hitting, kicking, and using a taser on King more than 50 times as he lay on the ground. The video, released to the world via news outlets, instantly became the visual proof of police brutality that civil rights activists had long described. It was a clear, devastating document of excessive force. Despite the damning video evidence, the trial of the 4 officers was not held in Los Angeles, but in the predominantly white, conservative suburb of Simi Valley, Ventura County. This change of venue was immediately controversial. The trial began on March 5, 1992. The prosecution strategy was simple: play the tape. Let the jury see the violence for themselves. The defense, however, was brilliant and chillingly effective. They dissected the video frame by frame, arguing that the officers were not acting with malice but following their training protocols. They claimed King was in control, that his movements were aggressive, and that the repeated baton strikes were justified attempts to subdue a large, non-compliant suspect. They used the video against itself, turning a supposed document of truth into a fragmented, subjective puzzle, arguing that the chaotic reality of police work could not be judged by a sanitized video recording. On the afternoon of April 29, 1992, the verdicts were announced. The all-white jury found all 4 officers not guilty of assault, with the jury deadlocked on only one charge against Powell. The city of Los Angeles erupted. The acquittal was seen not just as a failure of justice for Rodney King, but as a devastating indictment of the entire American legal system's inability to protect black citizens from state-sanctioned violence. The 1992 Los Angeles riots began almost immediately. Over 6 days, the unrest resulted in 63 deaths, more than 2,000 injuries, and an estimated $1 billion in property damage. The city was burning, a direct response to a single, infuriating legal decision. The Rodney King trial remains a brutal monument to the power of interpretation over fact and the explosive consequences when the legal system is perceived to be fundamentally unjust to a community. The officers were later successfully prosecuted in a federal civil rights trial for violating King's rights, but by then, the scars on the city and the nation were already permanent. Number 4. The Chicago 7, the War on Protest. The height of the Vietnam War, a nation in turmoil, and a political convention that became a battlefield. The summer of 1968 saw the Democratic National Convention held in Chicago. Thousands of young people, anti-war activists, and political radicals descended on the city to protest the war and the political status quo. Mayor Richard J. Daley ensured a massive, aggressive police presence. The resulting confrontations, which spilled from the parks onto the city streets, were widely documented as a police riot, with officers clubbing, beating, and tear-gassing protesters and bystanders alike. The new administration of President Nixon sought to make an example of the protest leaders. 8 men, Abby Hossman, Jerry Rubin, David Dellinger, Tom Hayden, Rennie Davis, John Froines, Lee Weiner, and Bobby Seale, were charged with conspiracy and inciting to riot. The trial, which began on September 24, 1969, was less a legal proceeding, more a piece of theater. The defendant who received the most egregious treatment was Bobby Seale, the co-founder of the Black Panther Party. Seale insisted on representing himself after his attorney, who was recovering from surgery, could not attend. The judge, Julius Hoffman, no relation to Abby Hoffman, repeatedly denied Seale the right to represent himself or have his lawyer present. When Seale repeatedly stood up to demand his constitutional rights, the judge ordered him bound and gagged in the courtroom. For days, Seale sat literally unable to speak, a harrowing visual symbol of the suppression of civil rights and free speech. After the defense attorneys walked out in protest, Judge Hoffman declared a mistrial for Seale and severed him from the case, making the defendants the Chicago Seven. The remaining trial was a constant battle. Defense attorney William Kunstler was verbally assaulted by the judge. Defendants openly mocked the proceedings, bringing Viet Cong flags into court, and once Abby Hoffman blew a kiss to the jury. The jury returned its verdicts on February 18, 1970. All 7 defendants were acquitted of conspiracy. However, 5 were convicted of crossing state lines with the intent to incite a riot, a charge based on a controversial law. More shockingly, during the trial, Judge Hoffman issued unprecedented 159 contempt of court citations, sentencing the defendants and their attorneys to years in prison for their courtroom behavior. The convictions and the contempt findings were later overturned on appeal. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals cited Judge Hoffman's antagonistic attitude and clear failure to maintain judicial impartiality. The Chicago 7 trial became a symbol of the government's overreach during a time of social and political upheaval. It demonstrated how the establishment weaponized the courtroom to punish dissent, but ultimately it served to radicalize a generation, proving that the justice system itself could be a political battleground. Number 5. Sacco and Vanzetti. Fear, Prejudice, and the Electric Chair. They were immigrants. They were anarchists. They were accused of murder. The early 20th century saw a case that emerged as a global flashpoint, exposing America's rising fear of radicalism and immigrants. The question wasn't about bullets and evidence. It was about whether justice could ever be blind when prejudice was the judge. On April 15, 1920, a paymaster and a guard were shot and killed during a robbery of a shoe company payroll. The following month, 2 Italian immigrants and self-proclaimed anarchists, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, a shoemaker and a fish peddler, were arrested. They were carrying firearms at the time and gave contradictory statements to the police. This was the era of the Red Scare. Anarchists and radical leftists were the primary targets of federal and local law enforcement. Sacco and Vanzetti were known activists, openly advocating for the overthrow of government. The trial opened on May 31, 1921. The evidence against them was highly circumstantial and based on questionable eyewitness testimony. Sacco's pistol was linked to a bullet fragment, and Vanzetti was identified by several people, but the defense later produced alibi witnesses for both men. The true focus of the trial was less on the crime and more on their political beliefs. The presiding judge, Webster Thaler, exhibited clear bias, later stating privately that, although he was probably guilty, Vacco, Vanzetti, looked it. The prosecutor, Frederick Katzman, aggressively questioned the defendants not about the robbery, but about their political views, their aversion to military service, and their radical friends. The defense attorney, Fred Moore, was unable to counter the powerful narrative being woven that Sacco and Vanzetti, as unassimilated radicals, were inherently criminals who deserved punishment regardless of the physical evidence. On July 14, 1921, both men were convicted of first-degree murder. The conviction sparked an international outcry. Intellectuals,
artists, and labor leaders around the world protested the verdict, believing the men were martyrs being executed for their political views and their Italian heritage, not for their crimes. The ensuing years were filled with appeals, rejected motions for a new trial, and massive public demonstrations. Despite a last-minute investigation ordered by the governor of Massachusetts, the sentences were upheld. On August 23, 1927, after 7 years of legal battles, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti were executed in the electric chair. The Sacco and Vanzetti case became a permanent, painful scar on the American conscience. It didn't just question the judicial system, it questioned the soul of the nation, highlighting how easily fear and xenophobia could override due process. Decades later, in 1977, Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis formally proclaimed that any disgrace should be forever removed from the names of Sacco and Vanzetti, acknowledging that the trial had been permeated by prejudice. The case stands as a chilling reminder that in times of national anxiety, the search for a scapegoat can tragically eclipse the search for truth. Number 6. John T. Scopes, The Monkey Trial. Darwinism in the Dock. A textbook, a classroom, and a state law that declared war on science itself. In the summer of 1925, a small town in Tennessee became the stage for one of the greatest legal clashes in American history, the Scopes Monkey Trial, where the fate of a humble high school teacher would decide the battle between the theory of evolution and the biblical creation story. In 1925, the state of Tennessee passed the Butler Act, which made it illegal for any public school teacher to teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. John T. Scopes, a 24-year-old high school football coach and science teacher in Dayton, Tennessee, agreed to be the test case. He was not a dedicated evolutionary theorist, but he and a group of local businessmen believed challenging the law would put Dayton on the map. The trial was deliberately staged, a calculated act of civil disobedience. The trial, which began on July 10, 1925, was an unparalleled spectacle. It drew not only the national press, but hundreds of onlookers, street vendors, and religious revivalists to the small town. The heat was so intense that the proceedings eventually had to be moved outdoors onto the courthouse lawn. The lawyers involved were legendary. For the prosecution stood William Jennings Bryan, a 3-time Democratic presidential nominee, a devout Christian, and arguably the most famous orator in America. For the defense stood Clarence Darrow, the nation's most famous and feared defense attorney, a staunch agnostic, and a fierce defender of intellectual freedom. The courtroom became a philosophical battlefield. Darrow's objective wasn't to acquit Scopes, it was to put the Butler Act on trial. He argued that the law violated the separation of church and state and inhibited academic freedom. The climax of the trial occurred when Darrow took the extraordinary step of calling William Jennings Bryan himself to the stand as an expert witness on the Bible. Under Darrow's relentless, hostile cross-examination, Bryan was forced to admit that he did not interpret all parts of the Bible literally. He struggled to answer basic questions about biblical chronology and the source of his own fundamentalist beliefs. It was a devastating moment for Bryan and the anti-evolution movement, a public humiliation captured by every major paper. Despite Darrow's triumph in the philosophical exchange, the trial was, legally, a foregone conclusion. The jury deliberated for only 9 minutes. On July 21, 1925, John Scopes was found guilty and fined $100. However, the legal victory was short-lived. Scopes' conviction was later overturned on a technicality by the Tennessee Supreme Court. The true significance of the Scopes trial wasn't the verdict, but the cultural impact. It exposed the deep chasm in American thought between religious fundamentalism and modern science. Though the Butler Act wasn't repealed until 1967, the trial severely damaged the credibility of the anti-evolution movement in the eyes of the educated public, shifting the national conversation towards scientific reasoning in education. It remains the most famous legal battle over the curriculum of a classroom, a persistent reminder of the delicate balance between faith, law, and education in the United States. Number 7. Leopold and Loeb, the perfect crime. They were brilliant, they were privileged, they were utterly devoid of conscience. In 1924, 2 wealthy, highly intelligent University of Chicago students decided to commit the perfect crime, a thrill kill designed purely to prove their intellectual superiority. They failed, but the resulting trial, featuring the powerful defense of Clarence Darrow, forced the nation to confront the very nature of human evil. Leopold, 18, and Richard Loeb, 19, were known around campus for their exceptional intellects and their obsession with the Nietzschean concept of the Übermensch, the Superman who stood above the common morality of society. On May 21, 1924, they set out to prove this theory by committing a murder. They chose a victim at random. 14-year-old Bobby Franks, Loeb's distant cousin, whom they lured into a rented car. They bludgeoned him to death, attempted to disfigure his face with acid, and dumped his body in a culvert near a bird sanctuary. Their mistake was leaving a crucial piece of evidence: Leopold's prescription eyeglasses, which were unique and traceable near the body. The two confessed and were charged with murder. The state of Illinois, under the wave of public revulsion, prepared to seek the death penalty. But the defense was led by the aging but still formidable Clarence Darrow, who was a staunch opponent of capital punishment. Darrow recognized he could not save his clients from conviction, but he vowed to save them from the gallows. The trial was not a standard jury trial. Darrow instead chose to enter a guilty plea to avoid a jury and argue for leniency directly to the judge, John R. Caverly, in what became a prolonged, dramatic sentencing hearing that began on September 10, 1924. Darrow's argument was a masterpiece of legal and social commentary. He did not deny the heinous nature of the crime, but he argued that the youths were products of their privileged intellectual environment and, more importantly, were psychologically ill. He suggested their crime was the tragic culmination of genetic factors and the severe mental state of youth rather than pure calculated malice. In an 11-hour closing argument, Darrow delivered one of the most famous speeches in American legal history, pleading for the judge to consider the inherent amorality of capital punishment, particularly for offenders so young. He argued, "The future is still before them. I am pleading for a time when children will be taught that the highest virtue is understanding, pity, and charity."
On September 10, 1924, Judge Caverly handed down his sentence. He acknowledged the severity of the crime, but ultimately sided with Darrow's plea to spare the boys' lives. Leopold and Loeb were sentenced to life in prison for the murder, plus 99 years for the kidnapping. The Leopold and Loeb case remains an unparalleled study in the intersection of wealth, intellectual arrogance, and pathology. It became a profound debate on the morality of the death penalty and the emerging role of psychiatry in the courtroom. It forced legal systems to consider whether a crime committed by a disturbed mind, no matter how calculated, could truly be judged by the same standards as a crime of pure malice. They paid for their hubris with their lives behind bars. Loeb was murdered by a fellow inmate in 1936. Leopold was eventually paroled in 1958. Their pursuit of the perfect crime proved nothing more than their own profound and tragic fallibility.
Number 8. The Scottsboro Boys. Justice on the color line. A freight train, 2 accusations, and 9 lives changed forever by the suffocating hatred of the Jim Crow South. In 1931, the case of the Scottsboro Boys became a rallying cry for the emerging American civil rights movement, exposing the systemic cruelty of a justice system built entirely on the color of a man's skin. In March 1931, 9 young black teenagers, ranging in age from 13 to 20, were riding a freight train through Alabama when they got into a fight with a group of white boys. After the fight, the Scottsboro teenagers were arrested. On the train, 2 white women, Victoria Price and Ruby Bates, accused the 9 boys of raping them. The accusations were almost immediately dubious. Medical evidence later suggested no rape had occurred, and the women's testimony was contradictory. Yet, in the deeply segregated South of the 1930s, the outcome was predetermined. The trials, held in the town of Scottsboro, were a terrifying farce. The boys were quickly indicted, and the judge appointed lawyers who barely spoke to the defendants before the trial began. The prosecution whipped up a frenzy of white rage and fear. In the first round of trials in April 1931, within days of the accusation, all but the youngest defendant were convicted and sentenced to death. The case attracted the attention of the Communist Party's International Labor Defense, ILD, and the NAACP, who used the platform to expose the utter lack of due process in the South. The appeals process reached the Supreme Court of the United States twice, resulting in 2 landmark decisions. In Powell v. Alabama, 1932, the Supreme Court ruled that the boys were denied the right to effective counsel, establishing that indigent defendants facing the death penalty must be provided with adequate legal representation. In Norris v. Alabama, 1935, the court ruled that the exclusion of black citizens from the jury pool was unconstitutional, a major, though slow-moving victory against systemic racism in the courts. Despite these legal victories, the ordeal dragged on for a decade. The boys faced multiple retrials, often ending in guilty verdicts due to all-white juries and the relentless pressure of local politics. One of the accusers, Ruby Bates, even recanted her testimony, but the convictions continued. The legal battles and retrials continued through the 1930s and into the 1940s. Some of the Scottsboro boys spent years in prison. Others were paroled or had charges eventually dropped. The last defendant was finally paroled in 1950. The case was a brutal, extended lesson in how long and difficult the fight for civil rights would be. It became the first national issue that forced the country to confront the brutal racial bias inherent in its justice system. The Scottsboro Boys' legacy is one of the perseverance of legal principle over deep-seated prejudice.
Their ordeal helped lay the groundwork for the modern civil rights movement by proving beyond any doubt that the promises of the Constitution were not being extended equally to all Americans. It was a tragedy for the 9 individuals, but a slow, painful catalyst for change for the millions who watched their story unfold. Number 9. Bruno Richard Hauptmann, the Lindbergh Kidnapping, the crime of the century. He was an American hero, the aviator who crossed the Atlantic. The victim was his child, taken from his crib. The 1932 kidnapping of the infant son of Charles Lindbergh was called the crime of the century, an act of terror that gripped the nation and led to the creation of federal laws against kidnapping. The trial of the accused German immigrant, Bruno Richard Hauptmann, was a defining moment where public hysteria clashed with the quest for evidence. On the night of March 1, 1932, 20-month-old Charles Lindbergh Jr. was snatched from his nursery on the 2nd floor of the Lindbergh home in Hopewell, New Jersey. A ransom note demanding $50,000 was left on the windowsill, along with a crudely made ladder used to reach the window. The search for the child and the hunt for the kidnapper became an international sensation. After a chaotic and mismanaged ransom attempt, the child's remains were discovered on May 12, 1932, a few miles from the home. The break in the case came in September 1934, when marked ransom money was traced back to a German carpenter named Bruno Richard Hauptmann in the Bronx, New York. Hauptmann was arrested and maintained his innocence, claiming he was holding the money for a friend. The trial began in Flemington, New Jersey on January 1, 1935. It was the largest media spectacle since the Scopes trial, with more than 700 reporters descending on the small town. The courtroom was, by all accounts, overwhelmed by cameras, flashbulbs, and the sheer magnitude of public interest. The prosecution's case against Hauptmann was multifaceted. The ransom money, the clear link to the marked bills. The handwriting. Experts testified that Hauptmann's handwriting matched the ransom notes. The ladder, the most damning evidence. A lumber expert, Arthur Kohler, testified that the unique wood used to construct the kidnap ladder came from Hauptmann's attic floorboards, matching the grain patterns and nail holes perfectly. The defense was hampered by a lack of funds and the overwhelming public hatred for the defendant. Hauptmann's testimony, delivered in broken English, failed to convince the jury that he was innocent. On February 13, 1935, after 11 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict of guilty in murder in the first degree. Hauptmann was sentenced to death. Despite multiple appeals and a strong campaign by some who believed Hauptmann was a scapegoat who did not act alone, the verdict stood. Bruno Richard Hauptmann was executed in the electric chair on April 3, 1936. The Lindbergh kidnapping led directly to the creation of the Federal Kidnapping Act, or Little Lindbergh Law, which made kidnapping a federal crime when victims are taken across state lines, allowing the FBI to become immediately involved. The Hauptmann trial demonstrated the immense power of scientific and forensic evidence, particularly the work done on the wood ladder, to sway a jury. But it also illustrated the corrosive effect of public hysteria on due process. To this day, questions persist about the handling of the evidence and whether the immense pressure to convict someone overshadowed the pursuit of complete justice.
Number 10. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Secrets, Spies, and the Cold War. It was the dawn of the atomic age. 2 young American citizens were accused of handing the secrets of the most terrifying weapon ever created to the nation's deadliest enemy. The trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg was the legal flashpoint of the Cold War, a dramatic espionage case that ended not in a prison cell,
but with the first and only execution of American civilians for conspiracy to commit espionage in U.S. history. In 1950, during the height of McCarthyism and the Second Red Scare, the United States was gripped by paranoia about Soviet espionage. The FBI arrested a former Army engineer, Julius Rosenberg, for running a spy ring that allegedly passed on atomic bomb secrets to the Soviet Union. His wife, Ethel Rosenberg, was arrested shortly after, accused of typing the notes used by the spy ring. The evidence against Julius was strong, based heavily on the testimony of his wife's brother, David Greenglass, who was a machinist at the Los Alamos bomb project. The evidence against Ethel was far weaker, relying primarily on Greenglass's claim that she had typed up the notes. The trial began on March 6, 1951 in New York City. The atmosphere was charged with anti-communist fervor. The trial was presided over by Judge Irving Kaufman, and the prosecution was led by the ambitious Irving Sapol. The prosecution presented testimony detailing how Julius had allegedly recruited Greenglass to pass on classified information, specifically the blueprints for the atomic bomb. Greenglass testified against his sister and brother-in-law in exchange for a lighter sentence. The Rosenbergs denied all charges, asserting their innocence and invoking the Fifth Amendment multiple times. The defense struggled against the fear-mongering and lack of transparency that characterized the era. Key evidence related to the bomb secrets was highly classified and only vaguely presented, making it difficult for the defense to counter specifics. On March 29, 1951, the jury found both Julius and Ethel Rosenberg guilty of conspiracy to commit espionage. On April 5, 1951, Judge Kaufman delivered a chilling sentence. He described the Rosenbergs' crime as worse than murder, arguing that they had put into the hands of the Russians the A-bomb years before our best scientists predicted it could happen. He sentenced both Julius and Ethel Rosenberg to death. The sentence was immediately controversial. Many intellectuals and public figures believed that the sentence, particularly for Ethel, was excessive and designed to pressure Julius into confessing. Appeals and calls for clemency came from around the world, including from the Pope. President Dwight D. Eisenhower refused clemency, stating that their crime had directly resulted in the communist aggression in Korea, which caused the death of more than 50,000 of our soldiers. On June 19, 1953, after 2 years of legal battles, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed in Sing Sing prison. The Rosenberg trial remains one of the most polarizing events in modern American history. It became a powerful symbol of the excesses of the Cold War and the government's willingness to use capital punishment to enforce political conformity. Later declassified Soviet documents largely confirm that Julius was indeed a spy, but they suggest Ethel's involvement was marginal and that she was likely sentenced to death as leverage against her husband. The case continues to force us to ask painful questions about justice during wartime, the ethical use of testimony, and whether the pursuit of national security can ever justify the sacrifice of due process. From the small town in Tennessee that tried science, to the halls of justice that put immigrants on trial, to the streets of Los Angeles that burned when a video was ignored, these trials were more than court dates. They were moral audits of the American experiment. They showed us the power of prejudice in the case of the Scottsboro Boys and Sacco and Vanzetti. They exposed the dangerous spectacle of the media in the story of Sam Shepard and the celebrity of O.J. Simpson. And they revealed the dark heart of political paranoia with the execution of the Rosenbergs. Each gavel slam echoed through history, reminding us that justice is not a static ideal, but a constant, messy, and dramatic struggle between the facts, the fear, and the fundamental belief in what America ought to be. The courts may close, but the questions these trials raised remain open, because the American story is still being written, and every injustice, every courtroom drama shapes the chapter we live in today.
If this deep dive into the legal history of the 20th century shocked you, hit the like button. What trial do you think had the biggest impact on American culture? Let me know in the comments below. And to stay informed on the stories that shape our world, subscribe and turn on notifications. We'll be back soon with another Untold Truth.